Working in Colombia is very difficult. Like if you're starting from the bottom, if you go to school here and you get a job at a school, it's very, very difficult. You have to work a lot of hours and you don't get paid a lot. And generally families have to sort of live together to make things work. But I guess we're not really talking about that. We're talking the experience of an expat or like a Canadian or Australian or American or European wanting to live in another country. So it's a completely different thing because again, the value of your money is 5 times more from those countries than it would be in Colombia. So with that being said, if you do have some money to invest, opening a business here is a lot easier because they want you to. They help you do it, right? In Canada, opening a business is very difficult. You have to jump through many, many hoops and you have to pay for a lot of, documents and lawyer fees. There's a lot that comes into play to opening a business in Canada. And because of that, usually businesses in Canada do pretty well, generally speaking. In Colombia, it's a lot easier to open up a business. However, businesses here, because they're easier to open, it's a little. I would say the competition is greater, and people don't have as much money to spend as they do in Canada. So your business in the beginning, it will be more difficult. You won't be making as much money. However, if you can open up a business here, which is and your clientele are also expats, that could be a very flourishing business. So it really depends what business you're getting into in Colombia, because it's I mean, opening it up is easier. However, it's more difficult to make money here than it would be in Canada, America, or Australia. In comparison, you would have to be more strategic here.
Yeah.
And again, if you can find a good client base that's not that that are foreigners, then that could be a really good flourishing business.
And good point. So, but even more broadly than that, right? Because of the internet now and the interconnectivity, a lot of that, like you can achieve those things. Like you could move to a place, have the time and energy to set up businesses or solve problems for people that are either in that country or outside of that country, and you can earn from that, right? So you could be in Colombia and have a business that solves problems for Canadians, get paid in Canadian dollars, and that could be very lucrative, right? But sort of more broadly, like in terms of opportunities, like let's use your example of Canada and Colombia. Do you think that there are more opportunities in Canada for you or for people, or more opportunities in Colombia? And when I say opportunities, I'm thinking like, when we talk about countries, one way to talk about them is in, level of development, so you have like a developed country or a less developed country or a third world country and a, first world country, that kind of stuff. And that typically refers to like, quality of life or level of development there. So it seems to me that the less developed a place, the more sort of opportunity there can be to essentially start to develop that place or continue developing that place in a certain way, right? Whereas if you're already in a developed place, it might be harder to sort of redevelop that place or change the direction of the development in that place. So if like you can have incumbents and people that are like, I've already set up the infrastructure for this, so they own all of that. Whereas in somewhere else, there might not be that infrastructure, and you could help develop that infrastructure, but develop it in a way that you might think is better or more useful or more productive than other ways. That kind of makes sense.
Right. I see what you're saying. Okay, so in Canada, I'll just like put the poverty at here, and then the gap between people who are in poverty and really rich, I would say the gap is like maybe something like this, right? Whereas in Colombia, the poverty and the rich gap is a lot wider. So I'm not saying there's more rich people in Colombia. That's not the case, but there's a lot more poverty in Colombia. So there's a huge gap, right? So to get to middle class is really difficult. To get from like poverty to middle class is super, super, super difficult. But if you can get into like the middle class, between the middle class and rich, those things are sort of developed, right? Already in a sense, like the education is developed because you can afford private education. Healthcare is much more developed because you can afford private healthcare. Um, what else? Neighborhoods are really safe because you're in that upper echelon gap. So the safety is higher, even though there's many dangerous areas in Colombia. Um, yeah, that's a good question, Rubes. Can you elaborate a little bit more? I'm having a difficult time with
So,
answering
well,
that
what
one.
you just said is interesting as well. I can elaborate, but just on that point you're making, so it's kind of easier, like as using Canada and Colombia as an example, it's easier to sort of move from Canada to Colombia and be in the middle class because the bar is so low, so to speak, in terms of poverty. Like there's more poverty. It's easier to come in and be at that middle class level. So you can it's more affordable to have a certain quality of life over there than it might be in Canada. Less competitive in that market.
Yeah,
But what I mean is like, um, you know, you might want to move to like the flashiest or the newest or the most technologically advanced city. And there's going to be opportunities there, like on the cutting edge of technology and all the rest of it. But I also think that there's huge opportunities in less developed places just because they're less developed. Like there's the opportunity to continue developing them. Now, you mentioned like, the poverty gap between the haves and the have-nots is much greater in Colombia. Um, and so trying to understand why that is, like why is that currently the case? Okay, so how much of that's to do with the government, how much of it's to do with the drug wars back in the day and cartels and different things. Like how much of that is an artifact of that? How much of it is to do with the education system or the lack of an education system for the populace in those certain areas? How much is it to do with cartels that have had a stronghold on certain areas, or what? Like it's a very complex topic. But also thinking like, okay, well then, if the gap is so big, well, what could Colombians do to either export? Like so, if earning pesos, that is that what it is, Colombian pesos?
yeah,
Yeah. So if earning pesos, um, you know, is very like earning enough pesos is really hard in Colombia. Well, are there exports that Colombian people could start, making to other countries to increase the amount of money coming into that country? Right. So one way to think
right,
about a country and its economic status or its purchasing power of its currency or whatever else is how much money flows into the country versus how much money flows out of the country. Right. So like if a country has to import lots of things, well, they've got to pay somebody else for that. Right. So that's money leaving the country to get those things into the country. Yeah. Whereas if like a country is a net exporter, they export more than they buy in. Well, then that country is going to be getting money from other countries. Okay. But then that doesn't guarantee that the people become wealthier or that their quality of living or their standard of living improves because that goes into like the government. And then if the government doesn't redistribute that, like, put that value back through education, through all sorts of different things like, infrastructure and the rest of it. And that doesn't necessarily improve the quality of the life of its citizens. And that's where like,
yeah,
that's where there could, a country might have all of these boxes ticked, but because of the government or the political climate or environment in that country, it also might not be attractive. Or some countries that have very good ones might be really attractive. Does that kind of make sense?
yeah, absolutely. And Colombia does generally, they don't do a very good job at wealth distribution whatsoever, and that's why you see the amount of poverty you do here, and because of that, the statistics are sort of skewed in many ways, right? Because the more poverty you have, the more violence you have in those impoverished areas, the more hunger you have, the more problems you have, the lower the education standard is. So there's a lot of things that would have sort of affect those statistics. But again, if you're someone who is deciding to leave Australia or Canada and you have some money saved up, you're not going to be experiencing any of those things.
Yeah.
Right? You're going to be experiencing a very high quality life. Take, for example, if you have a family and you want to come to Colombia, you can afford private education. It's not expensive here. You can afford private jujitsu lessons. It's not expensive. You can afford, to have someone live with you and clean your house, cook all your meals, right? And I know that sounds a little bit strange, maybe for some Canadians, but that's employment for people here.
Yeah.
So you are providing employment for somebody, and they are more than happy to do it. And you also can pay them a little bit more than what they're generally used to receiving, and it's still not going to be expensive, right? And if you treat that person like a I think it's like I don't know what's called in English, like a live-in maid, or I guess
Yeah.
cleans and does cooking. Yeah. So because Colombians are generally used to having that, they don't treat them poorly per se, but they treat them like the social economic status that they come from, right? It's not rude, but they don't treat them,
It's a class-based society in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you decide to come here and you want that experience, and you have someone living with you or coming to work for you, and you treat them with respect, you will bring tears of joy to their eyes, and they will love you. All you need to do is treat them like you do everybody else, like a family or friend, and you will have an excellent relationship with that person. And when Colombian people are good people, they are phenomenally good people. They're amazing people. But when Colombians are bad, then they'll fuck you up. But the good ones are exorbitantly good. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's a good point. But also too, so just having that extra money, like if you are moving to a place where your purchasing power is greater, you don't have to experience it as much, but it doesn't isolate you from that as well. So like that's another thing to consider in terms of where you move, like is how much of that poverty is around, or how big is the gap between the haves and the have-nots, because that can be an indicator of like, potential for civil unrest, so to speak. Like if enough people get the shits with the bad conditions that they're living in, that's when, revolutions or revolts start to happen. And that can be an indicator that the government isn't necessarily aligned with the people of that country.